Welcome back to Inside Dark History, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today I'm taking you into a story about the macabre history of the Blackridge family and a town held in their grip for over 2 centuries that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. What is the true price of prosperity? What unseen debts are incurred when a community flourishes while all others falter? These are not mere philosophical questions. For one small, isolated American town, they are the very cornerstones of a history written in shadow and paid for soul by soul over 2 centuries. The town is named Blackridge, and since its incorporation in 1801, every single mayor, without exception, has borne the same surname, Blackridge. A remarkable family legacy, the official histories claim, a testament to civic duty. But the truth buried deep beneath the town's pristine facade is a thing of far more terrifying symmetry. Our story, the unwritten one, begins not in the dust of the 19th century, but with the quiet arrival of a cardboard box on a historian's doorstep 3 months ago. No return address. No indication of its sender. Inside, nestled in aging tissue paper, lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed to the color of old bone, the ink faded but legible, the handwriting a delicate, urgent script. Tucked within was a single folded note that contained only 4 words: "Someone needs to know." The journal belonged to Eleanor Wright, a local historian of quiet brilliance and formidable resolve who vanished from Blackridge without a trace in the spring of 1998. What she discovered within the town archives and whispered local legends led her down a rabbit hole of disappearances, preternatural events, and a pattern so disturbing it threatened to unravel not only the town's history, but reality itself. This account, drawn from her final desperate research, is a warning. It is a testament to her sacrifice, for once you learn the secrets of the Blackridge family, you can never unknow them. And in a place like Blackridge, knowledge is not power, it is a curse. To understand the nature of this curse, one must first understand the place that birthed it. Blackridge is not a town you stumble upon by accident. It is a destination cradled in a deep valley between ancient brooding mountains that seem to guard it from the outside world. Fog clings to the hollows here like a shroud, lingering long after the sun has risen, muffling sound and blurring the edges of the world. It is a place where the smiles of the townspeople never quite seem to reach their eyes, a community bound by a shared unspoken secret. Its founder, Thaddeus Blackridge, arrived in 1801. Historical records portray him as a man of means and charisma who had mysteriously abandoned a prosperous life in Boston to carve a new future from the wilderness. But Eleanor Wright's journal tells a different story. It reveals that Thaddeus, a known correspondent with European occultists, did not choose the valley for its fertile soil, as is commonly believed. He chose it for what it was, a place the indigenous tribes called a thin place, a location where the veil between worlds was considered perilously fragile. They warned him, her notes indicate. They spoke of the ground being forbidden of voices that whispered on the wind. But Thaddeus was not deterred by their fears. He seemed drawn to the valley precisely because of them. He felt, as he wrote in a letter, a calling as if to a kingdom prepared just for me. The founding of Blackridge was immediately marred by unusual hardship. The first winter was a thing of brutal legend, with temperatures plummeting far below normal for the region. Food stores meticulously prepared mysteriously spoiled. Sickness spread, and then came the first disappearance. A young woman of 19, Mary Holloway, vanished one night in January 1802. The official account, signed by Thaddeus himself, claims she was taken by wolves. But Eleanor's research uncovered a different story, one told in hushed tones by the descendants of the original settlers. Mary had last been seen accepting an invitation to Thaddeus Blackridge's home for dinner. She never emerged. By spring, as the unnatural winter finally broke, Thaddeus was appointed the settlement's first mayor by a unanimous vote. Eleanor's journal chillingly notes that several families who had initially opposed his leadership were among those who had either fled the settlement or mysteriously perished during the brutal cold. A pattern was established in those nascent years, a horrifying covenant that would repeat for generations. Blackridge prospered while neighboring settlements struggled. Its crops grew with an almost defiant abundance. Its livestock multiplied beyond all rational expectation. And every 7 years, like the tolling of an unseen clock, someone would vanish without a trace. A troubled soul who wandered into the woods, a visitor who left without a word, a child who strayed too far from home. There was always an explanation, but the pattern remained unbroken. This horrifying symmetry was not a coincidence, it was a design. Eleanor Wright was not the first to notice it, but she was the most thorough in its documentation. Her journal is a meticulous, heartbreaking collection of census records, newspaper clippings, and private letters spanning nearly 200 years. She mapped each disappearance, each unexplained death, each period of uncanny prosperity onto a timeline that revealed a chilling precision. "There is a design here," she wrote, her handwriting growing shakier in later entries. "A horrible symmetry that cannot be coincidental. The family maintains its hold on this town through some pact, some ritual that requires a periodic sacrifice." The investigator who received her journal initially approached these claims with skepticism. Ritual, sacrifice, supernatural pacts. It sounded like the plot of a Gothic novel, not historical fact. But as he began to cross-reference her sources to verify her timeline, the skepticism began to curdle into a cold dread. The town of Blackridge exists. The Blackridge family has indeed provided every mayor since its founding, and the pattern of disappearances, one every 7 years, is horrifically supported by police records, newspaper archives, and missing persons reports dating back to the dawn of the 20th century. Then, using modern tools Eleanor never had, he found something more. A geographical anomaly. Using satellite imaging and topographical maps, he discovered that Blackridge sits at the exact center of a perfect geometric pattern formed by 7 surrounding mountain peaks. The formation is so precise it cannot possibly be natural. It was a geography that screamed of intelligent and perhaps malevolent design. Yet the most disturbing portent was not found on a map or in a dusty archive. It was found in the town's own visual history. In portraits and photographs kept at the Historical Society, a chilling detail emerged. From the daguerreotypes of Elias Blackridge in the 1830s, to the Polaroids of Conrad Blackridge in the 1950s, to the official portrait of Mayor Sylvia Blackridge today, the faces changed, the clothing evolved, but one feature remained unnervingly constant. They all had the same eyes. Not just a similar family trait, but the exact same penetrating, unnervingly intelligent grey eyes, staring out from different bodies across the chasm of 2 centuries. It was the first true sign that the thing haunting Blackridge was not just a family, but a single, enduring consciousness. It was the gaze of a single, enduring consciousness looking out at the world through a succession of human masks. And in that moment, the investigator finally understood. The thing haunting Blackridge was not just a family, a legacy, or a curse. It was a singular, immortal predator. This realization, born in the sterile silence of a university archive hundreds of miles away, was a watershed moment. The academic exercise was over. The detached historical inquiry had shattered, replaced by a chilling, urgent imperative. Eleanor Wright's journal was no longer a mere historical artifact. It was a map, a warning, and a baton being passed. To ignore it now, to file it away as an unsolvable anomaly, would be to become complicit in the silence that had allowed this entity to feed for over 200 years. The decision was no longer whether to investigate, but how to confront a truth that seemed to operate outside the known laws of reality. 3 weeks ago he made the drive. The journey into Blackridge is itself a form of psychological conditioning, The highways narrow into country lanes which in turn bleed into winding mountain roads that climb and twist with a dizzying serpentine logic. The air grows cooler thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sky seems to shrink, hemmed in by the colossal brooding peaks that stand like silent eternal sentinels. It is a descent, both literal and metaphorical, into a world apart. As he drove the investigator, a man we shall call Sullivan found the picturesque beauty of the landscape giving way to a disquieting sense of being watched. He rounded a bend, and a picturesque postcard view of the town appeared below, nestled in its valley like a perfect sleeping thing. But from this vantage point, with the knowledge he now possessed, it looked less like a sleeping town and more like a baited trap. His first official stop was the town hall, a formidable stone building that had stood since the late 19th century. He had secured an interview with Mayor Sylvia Blackridge under the pretense of writing an article on the governance of historic small towns. Her office was a study in controlled ancestral power. Dark wood paneling, polished to a deep luster, lined the walls which were adorned with the portraits of her predecessors, a gallery of familiar yet alien grey eyes. Sylvia herself was the perfect embodiment of this legacy. A woman in her late 50s with a striking mane of white hair and a posture of unassailable authority. She greeted Sullivan with a polite, practiced warmth, her voice smooth and measured. She spoke eloquently of family tradition, of civic duty, of the sacred trust the Blackridge family had held for generations. Sullivan played his part, asking about tax ordinances and infrastructure grants. But as the conversation wore on, he carefully began to probe the edges of the town's pristine narrative. He asked about the challenges of preserving history in an isolated community. He mentioned the difficulties of keeping accurate census data from the early years, and then with calculated casualness, he brought up the disappearances. He framed it as a question about local folklore, about the urban legends that give small towns their character. For a fleeting instant the mask slipped. It was not a dramatic change, but a subtle, chilling shift, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional cooling in the air. Her voice, when she replied, had lost its warmth, replaced by a layer of polished ice. "Every town has its tragedies, Mr. Sullivan." She said, her use of his name feeling less like a courtesy and more like a classification. "Blackridge has been fortunate in many ways, but we have had our share of sorrow. I would caution you against giving too much credence to local superstitions. They can distract from the real, tangible history of our community." The interview was over. It was a polite dismissal, but a dismissal nonetheless, and a clear, unspoken warning. That evening, the sense of unease intensified. He checked into the Blackridge Inn, a bed and breakfast that seemed on the surface to be a pocket of welcome normalcy. The owners, a couple named Harris, who had moved to the town only 5 years prior, were gracious hosts. They shared a sanitized Chamber of Commerce version of the town's history, over dinner, a narrative scrubbed clean of any mention of unnatural prosperity or cyclical tragedy. Yet later that night, as Sullivan walked down the hallway toward his room, he overheard Mrs. Harris on the phone in the parlor, her voice a tense, hushed whisper that carried in the old building's silence. "He's asking questions," she said, her voice strained. "About the family?" "No, I didn't tell him anything." "Yes, of course. I understand what happens to people who talk. We'll be going to my sister's for the weekend, just as you suggested." The next morning, the Harrises, their faces pale and their smiles forced, informed Sullivan of a sudden family emergency. The inn was closing for a few days. They suggested he try the small motel on the outskirts of town. The system was now actively working against him. The friendly facade had been peeled back, revealing the controlled, fearful mechanism beneath. He was being isolated. Instead of retreating, Sullivan pushed forward. His next stop was the local library, a somber brick building that smelled of decaying paper and secrets. He hoped to find more of Eleanor Wright's research, perhaps materials she hadn't been able to take with her. The head librarian, an elderly man named Parker, whose glasses seemed permanently fogged, grew visibly uncomfortable at the mere mention of Eleanor's name. "Ah, Eleanor," he sighed, polishing his spectacles with a trembling hand. Brilliant, but troubled. She became obsessed with old legends, spent too much time alone in the archives, started seeing patterns that weren't there. His words were practiced a well-rehearsed eulogy for a woman's reputation. When Sullivan pressed, asking what had happened to her, Parker claimed she had moved away, suddenly leaving no forwarding address. This was a direct contradiction of the police report Sullivan had found, which officially listed her as a missing person. The lie was clumsy, artless, and all the more terrifying for it. Excusing himself, Parker disappeared into a back room. Seizing the opportunity, Sullivan slipped past the front desk and found a door marked Archives, Staff Only. The air inside was thick and still. Row upon row of shelves were filled with decaying boxes and ledgers. In the center of the room on a large table lay evidence of recent activity. Newspaper clippings about disappearances spread out in chronological order. A map of the valley nearly identical to the one Eleanor had created with fresh pinpricks marking locations. And in a new clean notebook, fresh handwriting analyzing the very patterns Eleanor had died trying to expose. A jolt went through Sullivan. Someone else was continuing her work. A silent, hidden ally. He quickly photographed everything with his phone and slipped out a side door just as he heard Parker returning. Back on the street, the paranoia was no longer a feeling. It was a certainty. He felt eyes on him from the windows of the storefronts, from passing cars, from pedestrians who seemed to halt their conversations as he walked by. A black sedan, sleek and modern and utterly out of place in the vintage town, was parked across from the library. He decided to test the town's surveillance. He walked to the local historical society, taking a circuitous route through residential streets. The black sedan followed, maintaining a careful professional distance. The curator of the Historical Society, a young, initially enthusiastic woman named Meredith Chambers, gave him the same practiced speech. The Blackridges were private people. Their personal papers were kept at the manor. When Sullivan mentioned the pattern of disappearances, her bright expression hardened into a familiar guarded mask. "I think you should be careful about the kind of story you're trying to write," she said, her voice low. "Blackridge is a close-knit community. We look after our own. We don't appreciate outsiders coming here to sensationalize our tragedies for clicks and views, Mr. Sullivan." She knew his name. He had never told her his name. The message was clear. "We know who you are. We are watching you. Stop." Shaken, Sullivan ducked into a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind to break the tale and collect his thoughts. The air inside was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and baked goods. It felt like an island of normalcy. Seeking to ground himself, he made small talk with the young barista. Her friendly, open demeanor was a relief. When he mentioned he was researching the town's history, her expression brightened. "Oh, you should talk to my grandfather," she said, with genuine excitement. "Raymond Cooper, he's lived here his whole life, 92 years, knows all the old stories. He's always complaining that the younger generation doesn't care about preserving the town's true history." She scribbled an address on a napkin. It felt like the first real, unguarded gesture he had received since arriving. Leaving the coffee shop, he made sure the black sedan was gone before heading toward Maple Street, a seed of hope sprouting in the barren landscape of fear and hostility. Raymond Cooper lived in a modest, well-kept bungalow on a quiet street lined with maple trees a world away from the imposing grandeur of Blackridge Manor. When he opened the door, Sullivan saw a man whose body was stooped with age, but whose eyes were startlingly sharp and lucid. When Sullivan stated his purpose, that he was investigating the history of the Blackridge family and that he had Eleanor Wright's journal, the old man's expression shifted from weary curiosity to a sudden, intense focus. "I've been waiting," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." He invited Sullivan in without hesitation. The living room was a museum of a life lived in the shadow of the town's secret. The walls were covered with photographs of Blackridge through the decades, a silent visual testament to its unchanging nature. Raymond confirmed everything. The unnatural prosperity. The 7-year cycle. the unbroken line of Blackridge mayors. He had been friends with Eleanor. He had helped her with her research, sharing stories his own father and grandfather had passed down. Then, his voice cracking with a grief still raw, after 70 years he revealed the true cruel nature of the town's pact. "My father," he began, his hands trembling as he spoke, "tried to run against Conrad Blackridge for mayor in 1953. He was a good man. People listened to him. For the first time, a Blackridge was in danger of losing an election." He paused, steadying himself. "A week before the vote, my little sister Sarah vanished, just gone, from the school playground. One minute she was on the swings, the next she wasn't." He showed Sullivan a small, framed photograph of a smiling little girl with pigtails. "The police chief, Conrad's cousin, came to our house. He was very sympathetic. He suggested my father withdraw from the race to focus on the family crisis. So he did. My father was a broken man for the rest of his life. Sarah was never found." Raymond looked Sullivan directly in the eye, his own gaze burning with the cold fire of a lifelong suppressed rage. "That's when we finally understood." He whispered the words carrying the weight of a terrible revelation. "The pattern isn't just about the disappearances every 7 years. That's for the entity. That's for the land. There's another pattern, a crueler one for the people. Anyone who openly opposes a Blackridge, anyone who threatens their power, loses something, not their own life, something more precious." This was the secret that kept the town in line. Not just fear of a supernatural entity, but the certain targeted and exquisitely painful punishment for any act of defiance. The prosperity of Blackridge was not just purchased with the lives of strangers, it was guaranteed by the broken hearts of its dissidents. The revelation settled in the quiet living room with the weight of a tombstone. It was a truth so monstrously elegant in its cruelty that it explained everything: the town's unwavering obedience, the fear that masqueraded as respect, the generations of silence. The prosperity of Blackridge was not just purchased with the blood of the forgotten, it was guaranteed by the broken hearts of those who dared to remember. Sullivan now understood that he was not just investigating a historical mystery. He was standing on the edge of a battlefield where the weapons were not guns or knives, but love and memory twisted into instruments of terror. Raymond, seeing the dawning horror in Sullivan's eyes, rose slowly and retrieved a dusty wooden box from beneath his sofa. Eleanor knew she was close to the truth. He rasped, his voice thin with age and sorrow. She suspected the sacrifices weren't just for prosperity. They were for something else, something fundamental. He lifted the lid. Inside was not just a collection of clippings, but a trove of artifacts Eleanor had entrusted to him. Letters she had missed, diaries from families long since vanished, and most importantly, a hand-drawn map. It was a crude but detailed rendering of the forest north of town, and on it 2 locations were circled in red ink. One was marked E's Cabin, Safeguard. The other, deeper in the woods, was marked with a chilling, spidery script, the Stone Circle. Raymond pressed a small cold iron key into Sullivan's hand. "This is to her cabin. She left it with me for safekeeping just in case. Whatever proof she found, whatever final piece of the puzzle she had, it might still be there." He then pointed a trembling finger to the calendar on his wall. April 15th. "Be careful," Raymond whispered, his eyes wide with a fear that had not dimmed in 70 years. The 17th is only 2 days away. The warning hung in the air, a ticking clock counting down to the next sacrifice. Leaving Raymond's home, Sullivan felt the oppressive weight of the town's surveillance return with a vengeance. The black sedan was back parked discreetly at the end of the street. Knowing the Blackridge Inn was no longer safe, he drove miles out of the county, spending a restless night in an anonymous motel room, the images from Eleanor's journal and the echo of Raymond's story warring in his mind. The next morning, guided by Raymond's map, he returned to Blackridge via a network of winding back roads, parking his car at an overgrown trailhead. The path to Eleanor's cabin was barely visible, suggesting no one had set foot on it for years. The forest grew dense and silent around him, swallowing the sounds of the outside world. The cabin itself was a small, weathered structure nearly reclaimed by the wilderness. It sagged under the weight of time and neglect, a forgotten sanctuary in a forest of secrets. The iron key scraped in the lock, but turned. The door creaked open, disturbing a thick layer of dust that coated every surface like a fine grey snow. Time had stopped here on the day Eleanor Wright disappeared 27 years ago. A small kitchen area, a desk littered with books, a bed with a now mouldering mattress. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Sullivan began a methodical search, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. He checked under the bed behind loose stones in the fireplace inside hollowed-out books. Finally, his fingers brushed against a floorboard near the desk that felt slightly loose. Prying it up, he found a small, tin-lined metal box. Inside, protected from the damp, was another journal newer than the one he had received in the mail, and a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. This was Eleanor's final journal, and its contents extinguished the last embers of Sullivan's skepticism. Here, in her own frantic handwriting, was the final terrible truth. "They are not human," she wrote. Or not entirely. Thaddeus Blackridge did not make a pact for his family. He made a pact to become his family. He bound himself to an ancient, bodiless consciousness that dwells beneath the stones, a thing of immense power and unending hunger. The journal detailed her horrifying discovery. The 7-year sacrifice was not merely for prosperity, it was a feeding. And the succession of mayors was not a lineage, it was a shell game. The entity, the original consciousness of Thaddeus, moved from body to body. Near the end of a host's natural life, a citizen of the town always, someone without close family, ties, someone who wouldn't be immediately missed, would be chosen. This person would disappear, their life force consumed in the ritual which would empower the entity to transfer itself into the next designated Blackridge in line. Thaddeus never died. Eleanor wrote her last entry a near illegible scrawl. He simply continued. The eyes give it away. Always the same penetrating grey, regardless of the host body's original colour. The eyes are the only constant. Sullivan's hands shook as he turned to the second object in the box. Unwrapping the oilcloth, he found himself holding a small stone figurine. It felt impossibly ancient, carved from a dark, non-porous rock he didn't recognize. It depicted a humanoid figure with unnaturally elongated limbs and a featureless face except for 2 deeply carved hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Eleanor's notes theorized what it was, a piece of the entity itself, calcified into our reality, an anchor. She believed she had removed it from the center of the stone circle, an act of defiance she hoped might disrupt the ritual. It was likely the very act that had sealed her fate. He looked at the date on her final entry, April 16, 1998. The next day was the 17th, and now, 27 years later, the calendar in his motel room read April 17, 2025. It was today. It was tonight. There was no longer a choice to be made. Eleanor had tried to expose the truth and paid with her life. Raymond had spent decades paralyzed by grief and fear. It fell to Sullivan. He gathered Eleanor's final journal, the stone figurine, and his camera equipment. The hike to the stone circle, a mile deeper into the forest, was a journey into a growing dread. The very quality of the light began to change, the golden hue of late afternoon shifting to something sickly and greenish, as if filtered through an unseen aqueous medium. The forest fell utterly silent. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. There was only the sound of his own breathing and the frantic pounding of his own heart. And then he saw it. In a clearing that seemed unnaturally perfect stood a circle of waist-high standing stones. The grass within the circle was a vibrant emerald green, a stark contrast to the dead brown leaves of the surrounding forest floor. It was a pocket of unnatural life, fed by unnatural means. Concealing himself and his camera in a thicket at the edge of the clearing, he settled in to wait. As dusk bled into a moonless night, a soft phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the ground in the center of the circle. The air grew heavy, charged with static electricity, like the moment before a lightning strike. Then came the sounds, hushed voices, the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. A procession of figures in dark, formal clothing emerged from the trees. Leading them was Mayor Sylvia Blackridge. Behind her walked the town's inner circle: Parker, the librarian, Meredith, the curator, the police chief, and at least a dozen others. Last in the procession, flanked by two large men, was a young man whose vacant expression Sullivan recognized with a jolt of horror, the barista's assistant from the daily grind. He moved with a stiff, shuffling gait, his eyes unfocused as if in a trance. The group formed a perimeter around the stones. Mayor Blackridge stepped into the center, and the glow intensified, casting her shadow, long and distorted, behind her. "For 224 years we have maintained the covenant," she intoned, her voice ringing with an ancient authority. "The time has come again to honor our pact." The assembled townspeople began a low guttural chant in a language that twisted the air. The young barista was guided forward. Mayor Blackridge raised her arms to the sky, and her shadow began to move independently of her body, stretching and contorting into a shape that was no longer human. What happened next shattered all laws of rational explanation. The air within the circle seemed to fold in on itself, shimmering like heat haze, before tearing open into a rift of non-space, a distortion through which Sullivan glimpsed something. Something vast, ancient, and utterly alien. A formless shape of living darkness reaching through the rift toward the young man. Sullivan was paralyzed by a terror so absolute it felt like his own heart had stopped. All he could do was keep the camera recording as the entity enveloped the young man. There was no scream, no struggle. The boy's form simply dissolved, becoming insubstantial, his matter unspooling into the rift before he was gone entirely. The rift snapped shut, the glow faded, and Sylvia Blackridge collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing violently. But something had gone wrong. Instead of the ritual being complete, a new horror began. When Sylvia rose again, her movements were different, jerky, puppet-like, as if she were unused to her own limbs, and her eyes, once that cold, authoritative grey, now held the same vacant, hollow look as the vanished barista. At that same moment, an elderly woman standing just outside the circle, whom Sullivan recognized from portraits as Evelyn Blackridge, the mayor, before Sylvia gasped. Where her eyes had once been that distinctive Blackridge grey, they were now a muddy, confused brown. Her expression, for decades one of placid authority, was now one of pure, dawning terror, as if she had just awoken from a 50-year nightmare. The entity, disrupted and unstable, had been drawn back to Sylvia, and in the process, Evelyn's original consciousness, a prisoner in her own body for half a century, had been violently thrust back into control. Her head snapped in Sullivan's direction, her newly brown eyes widening, not in recognition of him, but of the horrifying reality of her situation. "Help me," she mouthed silently, tears streaming down her face. A twig snapped under Sullivan's foot. The police chief shouted, pointing directly into the underbrush. The townspeople turned as one, their solemn expressions melting away into something primal: rage, fear, and a terrifying bloodlust to protect their secret. Sullivan grabbed his camera and ran crashing through the forest with no regard for stealth, the sounds of the chase erupting behind him. He made it to Eleanor's cabin, barricading the flimsy door, his mind racing. The proof was on his camera, but he was trapped miles from his car, surrounded by a cult of fanatics. As he frantically considered his options, his hand brushed against the stone figurine in his pocket. It was now warm to the touch, almost hot. He remembered Eleanor's last overlooked passage. The figurine is the key. It can open the door, but it can also seal it, if returned, to the center stone and broken there. But the price is high. Whoever does this will be drawn through as the door closes. The cabin windows shattered. "Sullivan! We know you're in there!" The police chief's voice boomed. "Come out now!" Clutching the camera and the figurine, Sullivan slipped out a back window just as they broke down the front door. He ran blindly through the total darkness, pursued by shouts and flashlight beams. He burst back into the clearing of the stone circle to find a single figure waiting for him, Evelyn Blackridge. She stood alone, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "I remember everything now," she said, her voice shaking, but clear. 50 years of watching through my own eyes as something else controlled my body. 50 years of silent screaming. The voices of their pursuers were getting closer. "You have the figurine, don't you?" she asked, her eyes fixed on his pocket. "Eleanor told me about it before they took her." She held out her hand, but Sullivan hesitated. He couldn't ask this woman who had already lost everything to make this final sacrifice. "I'll do it," he said, pressing the camera into her hands instead. "Take this. Get to my car. Get this evidence out. Make sure the world knows." "They won't let me leave alive," she said, a sad, resolute smile on her face. "I have been their prisoner for 50 years. Let me choose my own end." Before he could argue, the first of the townspeople, the police chief with his gun drawn, broke into the clearing. Behind him, Sylvia staggered forward, her movements a grotesque parody of a walk, her eyes now completely black voids. With surprising strength, Evelyn snatched the figurine from Sullivan's hand and ran to the center of the stone circle. The ground began to glow again, responding to the artifact's presence. "Run!" she screamed at him. "Tell our story!" As the police chief fired his weapon and Sylvia let out a soundless, inhuman shriek, Evelyn Blackridge brought the figurine down hard against the center stone. It shattered with the sound of a thunderclap, and the air itself tore open. A writhing maelstrom of shadow and impossible light erupted from the ground, reaching for the convulsing Sylvia. In the heart of the chaos, Evelyn stood serene, her arms outstretched. As the entity thrashed and coiled around her, she looked directly at Sullivan one last time and nodded. He ran. He ran as the screams behind him were drowned out by a sound like the universe itself, tearing at the seams. He ran, clutching the camera to his chest like a sacred relic. Sullivan ran as the very earth seemed to buckle and heave behind him. The screams of the pursuing townspeople, once sharp with rage, were now choked off, swallowed by a sound that did not belong in our world, a deafening grinding tear as if the universe itself was being ripped at its seams. He did not dare to look back. He ran with the primal, unthinking terror of an animal fleeing a forest fire, crashing through the underbrush branches, whipping at his face, his lungs burning. He did not stop until he reached his car, collapsing against the cold metal, his body shaking uncontrollably. The forest behind him had fallen utterly, unnaturally silent. There was no pursuit, no voices, nothing but an abyssal stillness that felt more terrifying than the chaos it had replaced. As he fumbled for his keys and sped away from Blackridge, he risked a single glance in his rearview mirror. He saw it then, a column of silent, unearthly greenish-white light shooting up from the direction of the stone circle, piercing the night sky like a beacon or a wound. That was 3 weeks ago. In the immediate aftermath, Sullivan existed in a state of adrenaline-fueled paranoia, hiding in a series of anonymous motels, reviewing the footage from that night. In the weeks that followed, he began the slow, cautious process of trying to understand the consequences of what had happened. He searched for news reports, expecting to find accounts of a massacre, a mysterious event, dozens of missing persons. He found nothing of the sort. Instead, a small, barely noticed item appeared in a regional geological survey report. It mentioned a sudden massive sinkhole that had appeared in a remote forested area of the county, necessitating the evacuation of several nearby homes for safety reasons. The collapse of Blackridge, the violent end of its 200-year pact, was being explained away by the mundane language of soil erosion and seismic instability. The rational world was asserting itself, patching over a wound, in reality with the most plausible lie it could find. But the true creeping horror was yet to come. The sinkhole was a physical event, but the true collapse was metaphysical. Driven by a need for confirmation, Sullivan tried to call Raymond Cooper's number. A stranger answered a woman who claimed with genuine annoyance that she'd had the phone number for years. He searched for Blackridge on recent satellite maps and digital directories. It was gone. The area was now simply listed as unincorporated county land, a blank space of forest and mountain. Official records were being systematically altered. Census, data property deeds, town charters, all of it was vanishing from digital archives as if a ghostly hand was meticulously deleting a history it no longer wanted to be remembered. The town was not just destroyed, it was being erased. Perhaps without the entity's preternatural energy to anchor it to our plane of existence, the town itself, a creation of the pact, was fading from reality. Or perhaps something else, something human, with immense influence, was undertaking the greatest cover-up in history, scrubbing the memory of Blackridge from the world. Today, Sullivan lives a life in the shadows, a ghost haunted by a town that no longer exists. He has become the new keeper of the story, just as Eleanor and Raymond were before him. The evidence he so desperately escaped with is both his vindication and his curse. The video from that night is deeply problematic. Much of it is distorted by static and visual artifacts, as if the camera's lens, a product of our rational world, could not fully process the violation of physics it was recording. The entity itself appears only as a shimmering, incomprehensible void, but there is enough. The procession of townspeople is clear. Sylvia Blackridge's incantation is audible. The young man's horrifying dissolution, though blurred, is unmistakable, and the final chaotic moments of Evelyn's sacrifice are terrifyingly, heartbreakingly clear. It is enough to corroborate the story, enough to raise serious, world-shattering questions, but it is not enough to be believed without the narrative to frame it. And so he lives in hiding, organizing Eleanor's research, cataloging Raymond's evidence, and preparing this account, all the while knowing the danger may not be over. The legacy of Blackridge is not confined to a forgotten valley. It is a haunting that follows him. Twice now he has glimpsed a black sedan identical to the one that stalked him in the town, parked for hours down the street from his rented apartment before silently disappearing. Once, while walking through a crowded city market, he saw her, a woman with the same sharp features and guarded expression as Meredith Chambers from the Historical Society, standing on a corner watching him before melting back into the crowd. Are these real threats, remnants of a human network that supported the entity and now seeks to silence the last witness, or are they merely phantoms born of a mind stretched to its breaking point by trauma? The ambiguity is its own form of terror. And then there are the dreams. He dreams of the stone circle not as it was, but as it is now, a gaping, silent wound in the earth. He dreams of a voice, ancient and patient, calling to him not with malice, but with a terrible, lonely hunger. Is it truly gone, he wants to believe? Evelyn's sacrifice sealed the rift permanently, that her final act of defiance banished the entity back to whatever cold, lightless realm it came from. But sometimes, in the liminal moments between wakefulness and sleep, he feels a presence, a sliver of that ancient watching consciousness, and he is gripped by a final, horrifying question. What if in that cataclysmic moment of its destruction the entity did not die? What if, when its anchor to our world was shattered, it was not banished but simply released, a free-floating predator, now untethered to place or bloodline, free to seek a new home? This is the legacy of Blackridge, a story of courage and sacrifice, but also a collection of terrible, unanswered questions. What is the nature of evil? Was the entity a malevolent demon or simply a predator, operating according to its own alien laws of survival? And was the true evil found in the generations of human complicity that fed it? Justice in this case is a complex and unsatisfying notion. There can be no trial for a thing that defies physics, no prison for a consciousness that wore human bodies like clothing. The only justice to be found was the one enacted by Evelyn Blackridge, a woman who reclaimed her soul from a 50-year prison and chose her own ending, not for vengeance, but to break the cycle. Her sacrifice, along with Eleanor's relentless pursuit of the truth and Raymond's quiet decades-long vigil, is the only light in this long, dark history. Their story is a testament to the idea that even in the face of an ancient and overwhelming darkness, the will of a few determined individuals can shatter a corrupt reality. But it is also a warning. It is a warning that the histories we read are often the stories the victors have chosen to tell, and that beneath the surface of our most cherished communities may lie foundations of forgotten pain and unspeakable compromise. The story of Blackridge is extreme, a confluence of occult belief and otherworldly horror. But the pattern in its most basic form is a human one. So check your local history. Look for the towns that prospered inexplicably when all others failed. Look for the families whose names are etched onto every building, every street sign, every position of power generation after generation. Look for the stories of those who opposed them and then fell silent, their fortunes ruined, their families broken. Watch for those distinctive, unchanging eyes, a gaze that seems to hold a wisdom far older than the face it looks out from. And if you should find such a place, a community whose good fortune seems just a little too perfect, a little too blessed, perhaps it is time to ask yourself what price was truly paid for it, and who is still collecting the debt.